Hello, and welcome to the Customer Strategist webinar, Prepare for the Unexpected, How to Deliver Outstanding Customer Experiences with Every Interaction. I'm Liz Glogowski, Editor-in-Chief of the Customer Strategist Journal, and I will be moderating today's event. I'm joined today by Don Peppers and Ron Wince of Peppers & Rogers Group, a teletech company. Don is a founding partner of Peppers & Rogers Group and is recognized as one of the leading authorities on customer-focused management strategy. Ron Wince is Peppers & Rogers Group's President and General Manager. He leads the company's expanded offerings around process innovation, technology, and operational improvements. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Now, before we get to
Thank you.
Yes, welcome, guys. Now, before we get to the details of the webinar, let's quickly review the On24 interface. For a PDF copy of today's slides, you can click on the green Resources widget at the bottom center of your screen. We also have another PDF download available, which we will detail for you later in the presentation. We also encourage you to submit questions at any time during the event. Just click on the red Q&A widget, type your question, and hit Submit. Now, because we want to make this interactive, we've allotted some time for a Q&A section at the end to answer any questions that you may have. Now, your questions will be discussed by us anonymously. And we will also have a brief survey for you at the end of the program. Now, if you run into any issues, our technical team is on hand to answer any technical questions you may have. There's a gold help widget for you to check FAQs, or you can contact the team. Additionally, contact information for Don Peppers and the PRG team will be posted at the end of our event. And since this is our inaugural Customer Strategist Journal event, there's a link to the online version of the journal in the pink globe widget. Now, you can check that out to register or read articles from past issues. You can also sign up for a free quarterly subscription. And you'll notice on this slide that I've got a hashtag, customer strategy. So during the event, I will be live tweeting from the @PeppersRogersGroup hashtag Twitter feeds. So I encourage you to tweet and share your webinar experience using the hashtag customer strategy, so we can make it interactive on Twitter as well. So today's presentation will focus on 4 types of customer interactions that companies can plan for. Don and Ron will drill down into the strategies and tactics needed to succeed for each interaction category. We will then examine the role that technology plays in enabling and advancing customer-company interactions, as well as what it means for competition. Now, during the event, there will be a poll question for you to answer, and we've set aside some time at the end, as I mentioned, for the interactive Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. So with that, I will hand it over to Don Peppers to begin discussing the 4 types of customer interactions.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Liz. Thank you. And glad to be here. This webinar began because of an analysis that we did at Peppers & Rogers Group of the different types of interactions that typically customers engage in. And one of the ways we categorize these interactions is in terms of how important the interaction is to the customer, that is how engaged the customer is, and how easy the interaction is to automate or standardize. How easily can you anticipate the interaction and plan for it? And we put these 2 dimensions on a graph that looks kind of like this, and I'll give you a second to absorb this. There are 4 quadrants to the graph, but across the horizontal, we're talking about how high is the amount of process standardization. So if you have a highly standardized process, you're over on the right side, and if you haven't standardized the processes, then you're over on the left side. And if the customer is highly engaged, it's at the top of this graph, and if the customer is not so highly engaged, it's at the bottom part of the graph. And by engagement, we're really talking about whether the interaction is, top of mind, whether it involves some sort of emotional commitment on the part of the consumer, or whether it's simply just an implicit kind of day-to-day engagement. Now, I guess what I'd like to do is I'd like to take each of these quadrants, 1 quadrant at a time, and just go over what we're talking about. Let's start with quadrant number 1, which is the business as usual quadrant. Here you have the vast majority of customer interactions with any sizable business are going to fall into this quadrant because these are routine transactions. There's a whole lot of them. They're fairly automated. There's a high potential to anticipate these types of moments of truth with the customer. So some examples, providing product information or selling or servicing a product, collecting or processing a payment, interacting online in the call center when the customer does that, or interacting at the store or the point of sale. Many of these kinds of interactions can be entirely automated, which gives the company the ability to hardwire customer-centric processes into its computer system. So let me just give an example. When you go onto Amazon.com and you select a book that you've already bought, before they sell it to you, they'll warn you. You already bought this book once. Are you sure you want to buy it again? Now, obviously, that's an example of a process that Martha Rogers and I use to we call it proactive trustworthiness or trustability, where Amazon is actually proactively protecting you from making a mistake. But there's nobody at Amazon making that decision when you are logged in. It's a line of code that's hardwired this trustability into Amazon's processes. The same with iTunes when they tell you you've already bought this particular tune. Are you sure you want to buy another version of it? And so those are really good opportunities for standardization around this quadrant. So what are the strategies you pursue in Quadrant 1, business as usual? Well, first of all, don't make mistakes. Do things right way, okay? Don't make mistakes. Demonstrate your good intentions. You can hardwire them into the automation process. You can hardwire your willingness to trust the customer and to be trusted by the customer. Not making mistakes really involves demonstrating both product competence and customer competence. When we talk about product competence, we're talking about having a product that is on a quality par with your competitive set. You don't have to be the cheapest, but you have to be a fair price for the value. You have to have reasonably comparable features and service levels. You don't have to be the best quality, but you need to be on a par with your competitive set in your category, or you won't be perceived as product competent. And customer competence involves deploying customer insight to treat this customer based on what you already know about the customer or what the customer told you. You have to have the ability to interact with the customer. You have to have some ability to customize your offering or your treatment or at least your communication stream with the customer. And you want to generate customer trust. So the volume of these is high, but they're also declining over time as customers expect a more and more individualized experience. And some of the tactics you might use, for instance, would be to enable self-service, right? A customer can make their own decisions, and they feel a sense of accomplishment when they solve their own problem. And the benefit is you generate trust. You have a cost-effective and reliable product. And the risk is if you don't do this, if you don't enable this kind of routinization, this sort of automation of a standard and predictable and anticipatable process, the customers are soon going to deselect because they'll consider the interaction poor and labor-intensive on their part. Ron, do you have some comments?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Don, the important part here is to try and make it more customer-centered from a standpoint of they control the interaction themselves. So even though there is a declining volume, it's still a fairly high amount of effort or a high amount of transactions that go through this channel, which is very, high volume, low complexity, should be able to automate it fairly quickly. We almost always look at opportunities just to completely take human intervention out. How do we automate these? How do we do it on the customer's terms, whether it be a chat channel or even what looks like a virtual chat channel, or potentially just dealing with automation on the web like the Amazon example you gave. And typically what we find is when we begin to look at these different types of disparity between the complexity of these types of activities, is that if we can get these to low touch, low variation, low human interaction, they can also become very profitable channels. So obviously that's a big opportunity for businesses today to try and make that low touch, high volume types of activities that are typically routine as simple and fast as possible so that they can take the cost out but also make them a profitable interaction.
Sure. So some companies that do this well would be Intuit, where their product is kept up to date with constant feedback from customers. They take they have a whole lot of routine transactions that, and of course, the richer the tax code is, that is, the more complex it is, the more routine transactions can be anticipated by customers. And Intuit won a Gold CRM Excellence Award from Gartner and One-to-One Media for this in 2013. And LinkedIn and Facebook do the same thing. They thrive on self-service, with great, with large communities. Facebook over 1 billion, LinkedIn with over 200 million members right now. Amazon and Dell. Amazon's a great example because, as well as Dell, they've engaged customers to redesign their website for their direct-to-consumer offerings. And the best examples outside of commerce, which is what we discuss with our customers, are LinkedIn, Facebook, et cetera. But everybody thrives on self-service here. So the second quadrant is in the upper right. And here it is an event or a moment of truth with a customer that can be anticipated and planned for, but is more likely to be of high importance to the customer, something where the customer is truly involved in. And they're very
Don,
level. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Don. We do a fair amount of understanding the complexity within this. Even though the first quadrant was very simple, low touch, a lot of the disparity or variation comes up in these predictable life cycle events. So how can you take and understand those predictable events, whether it's financial services where you're trying to look at potentially people nearing retirement, or whether it is primary care where we're trying to look at typical events around the fact that people are nearing a specific age and they have to have specific types of care, or whether it's somebody who's getting ready to graduate from college and they're going to have a need for cars or places to live or to get relocated. Those are all opportunities where they're predictable events, but they might not happen as frequently as the first quadrant that we talked about.
And how well do companies anticipate these predictable events, Ron, in our experience?
Yeah, the better companies do well with it. So when one of the examples that we like to use a lot is USAA, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. But as you can imagine, they have a very good understanding of their customer base, being military. There's certain things that happen in the life cycle of a military member, all the way from when they first join the military until they depart the military, that they understand and have some affinity for, so they can develop some specific activities and specific ways of treating with those life cycle events. So, but it's not necessarily a competency that a lot of the customers we work with or clients we work with have.
Right. And if you had to outline some strategies for interacting with customers up in this upper right-hand quadrant, one thing we want to do is map the customer journey around the life cycle. So we at least have identified in advance what those life cycle changes are, or those very, very important events might be in a customer's life with the product. We standardize by creating scripts and templates to govern our response to common inquiries, and then we might even do things like set up a process for onboarding new customers or upgraded customers, so that we can help the customer anticipate these kinds of events.
And we also might, and I think we're seeing a lot of this in the market where people are leveraging analytics and big data to try and understand these customers better. It's still in its infancy. I think big data is one of those scary terms that everybody's trying to get their arms around and figure out how they're going to leverage the data that they have about their customers. But it's certainly a place in these strategies where we can leverage the information that companies have about their customers, and they can break them down and understand that there's kind of a low, medium, high level of complexity in this space. The low complexity we can assign scripts and standardize, and the high complexity are going to be high touch, high demand types of activities.
So we can apply segmentation strategies in this quadrant?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, it's probably one of our first tactics that we would leverage. We'd want to understand, just before you get to the customer mapping, we want to go do some analytics and develop customer personas, and then we'd map those customer journeys based on the persona that they represent, which would be driven by that segmentation activity.
Sure. Okay. And we have some examples here. You mentioned USAA.
Yeah, USAA actually, for those that don't know, USAA, has the highest NPS score of any company out there. And one of the things that they understand is the fact that as you go through a career in the military and even post-military, that you have certain activities, whether you're getting ready for deployment, whether you're getting ready to retire from the military, you're going to get promoted. They know for sure that you're going to have changes in duty stations, and they've developed tactics to deal with each of these different life interventions that happen as you go through your career. And that's to a person who I'm a former military myself, to a person that's and also a member of USAA. It's a huge help for me to understand that as I'm going through these transitions in my life, I can absolutely rely on USA to help me work through those. They've now begun to apply those in other things that would not be as predictable. For example, buying a car service or getting a mortgage. They may or may not be related to your life cycle event in the military, but there's certainly events that happen that are predictable and are going to happen at some point in your professional career.
And I know United does this. United is renowned for their ability to use customer data, not just from Mileage Plus members, but from non-members as well, to give real-time day of travel updates and so forth. And those interactions, as you can imagine, are of high involvement, high engagement interactions with the customers. Let me go to the next quadrant. Quadrant 3 is in the lower left, and here we have events where the process has not been very standardized, which probably means the event hasn't been well anticipated, hasn't been well planned for. Maybe it's difficult to plan for, but they're not of high involvement or engagement with the customer. So what are these kinds of events? Well, things like infrequently asked questions, or product attributes or uses that aren't highly popular with customers. That customers, I don't mean that they dislike them. I just mean that they don't pay attention to them. Okay, or in the B2B space, all the administrivia that surrounds customer sales reporting and details and record keeping and so forth. Those are all sort of low involvement activities on the customer's part, and sometimes it's difficult to plan for them. The strategy you need to apply in Quadrant 3 is, first you need to capture the data. You need a collection mechanism in order to capture all these unanticipated interactions and continue to try to standardize responses to them by developing guidelines that will deliver a frictionless customer experience. The threats to cost efficiency from a tactical standpoint, it really involves social learning. And Ron, we know something about that, right?
We do. One of the things that, we're all a teletech company, but one of the things that we've learned to do at teletech is leverage what I'll call community-based social learning, where each different, for example, call center agent might have the same question come in, and we're able to aggregate those answers and responses and the different questions together in kind of a social community-based platform that we've built that then allows you to get down to a single right answer so that we can get some consistency in the way that we respond to a customer's question or a customer's need, and then everybody gets down to a single way of approaching the customer with that answer.
And outside teletech, one of the really good examples would be a company like Cisco, where they do that same thing with their customer community. At teletech, they scan all the incoming calls for any frequency of questions that haven't been anticipated or encountered before. Cisco does the same thing with the customer community. They rely on customer communities to capture the new and different uses for their products. They even have a smart web technology group at Cisco, which constantly harvests comments to improve the site. And basically that's what they're doing is they're harvesting all these quadrant 3 interactions to make their customer experience better and better. And so that's a really good example. Now, quadrant 4 is where you have problems. These are surprises, trials, and tribulations. These are things that a lot of times a customer might be very involved in, but for which the company has not been able to plan in advance and may not have a strategy for dealing with these things. It could be maybe a natural disaster or crisis caused by some outside event. It could be a social media conflagration of some kind of meltdown on social media, or a big service issue, or it could even be a disruptive initiative by a competitor. And here in this quadrant, you need your employees to be able to make wise decisions that are in the interest of the company. That is, here you have to rely more than in the other 3 quadrants on the judgments and creativity and wisdom of your individual employees. And how do we do that? Well, fundamentally, you need employees to be engaged in their work and enabled to accomplish their mission. And basically what that means is engagement means that they like where they work, they like doing what they do, they believe that it's a worthwhile thing to do, they're proud of where they work, and they tell their kids and their friends where they work, and they're enabled to take action. They have access to the right information, they've been trained, and they have the authority to take action. I have a picture on this slide of a Mechanical Turk because it illustrates a story that Abraham Lincoln told once, that one of my favorite anecdotes. A reporter once asked Abraham Lincoln what the secret to General Grant's success was. At the time, Grant was cleaning up through the South. He was like mopping up in the rebels. And Lincoln was prone to anecdote, and he said, well, that reminds me of a story. And he said, in 1769, an Austrian civil servant dressed up a wooden man in an oriental costume and sat him behind a wooden chess table, and this man was reputed to be able to play chess. He was called the Mechanical Turk. And this civil servant took this Mechanical Turk all over the courts of Europe. He amazed kings and queens and princes everywhere until one day the Mechanical Turk played a chess master in Paris, and he beat him. The Mechanical Turk beat this chess master, whereupon the chess master was so irate, so humiliated by being defeated at the hands of a machine, that he bent down under the chess table and yanked the cabinetry apart. He literally ripped out the doors and went in and finally saw underneath the table, sure enough, there was a little man in there under the table with a magnet moving the pieces around. It wasn't the Mechanical Turk's arms at all. And the chess master said, hey, there's a person in there. So Lincoln turned to the reporter and said, that's General Grant's secret. There's a person in there. There's lots of people in the Union Army, lots more people in the Union Army than there are in the Rebel Army, and that's our secret. I think that's the secret also to a reliable quadrant 4 interaction company, a company that can handle unanticipated surprises, trials, and tribulations, is one where you have people in there, because computers are never going to do everything. They're never going to be able to do everything. So what does that mean from a strategy standpoint? Well, it means you need to motivate your high-value employees. And the most powerful motivations for what we call heuristic work, which is not formula work, but creative work like this, the motivations aren't really monetary, provided that your high-value employees are adequately compensated. What's really important is that they have autonomy in their decision-making, that they feel that they own their jobs, that they can make the decisions themselves. It's also important that they have the support of a team or a cohesive group, that they feel like they're part of a family. And it's also important, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, that it's also important that they feel that they have a purpose-driven profession or career. Now, in our experience as a consulting firm, what we found is that to the extent that a client can create a culture of customer trust, it tends to provide a really ideal platform for maximizing these kinds of motivations. Ron, you've taken a look at this kind of stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, we have. So we end up most of the time talking to our clients about what we call the social architecture. So if you go back to the 80s, Warren Bennis wrote a book called Leaders, and later that decade, Jack Welch used it to describe the secret sauce behind General Electric in one of his letters to the shareholder. And he said, what makes GE special is our common operating system and our common social architecture. And what we mean by that is most people would just describe that as culture. So when people say, hey, culture is killing us, they're really talking about this thing called social architecture, which is how people interact with each other, how they communicate with each other. It starts with the reason for being. What's your sense of purpose? Why are you here in the first place? What gets you up in the morning? And then developing some valued behaviors and some common language in the way we recognize people to kind of demonstrate the social architecture that we desire. A lot of times what we find is that companies don't start with that in mind. They typically start out with all the operating system stuff, changing the processes, changing the technology systems, et cetera. But underlying that is this idea of social architecture, which is how do we want people to work with each other. Now, when we talk about how do we create a customer experience social architecture, what we're talking about there is how do we build a DNA much like a Toyota or a Cancer Treatment Centers of America or some of the other organizations that you would highlight as having great cultures. It really comes down to the fact that they've looked at the social architecture and said, this is the way we want people to talk to each other. This is the way we want people to behave. This is the purpose that we want to have when we wake up in the morning and come to work every day. This is what gets us excited about it. And then the cycle to use piece of it is, in order to do that, you got to coach people through it. You got to reinforce it on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. It's got to be a part of the way that you think about building processes that are repeatable. You got to build a culture that's repeatable. And within that box of what we call social architecture, you allow people the opportunity to make their own autonomous decisions, rely on their own creativity, but you do give them this kind of boundaries that you work with that's called the social architecture, which has been described and developed by the CEO and his team. So.
Okay. And so that social architecture is a good sort of shorthand for what a lot of people call the culture at your company. It governs what employees do when no one's looking. When no one's looking over their shoulder, what your employees do, that could be, you could think of that as the culture of the company, right?
Correct. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. But in order to have a culture that's capable of handling these quadrant 4 interactions, you need to have highly engaged employees. And only a minority of U.S. employees could be classified as highly engaged today. The vast majority of employees are either not actively engaged or actively disengaged, some of them. Hay Group says there are 4 primary requirements to engage your employees. One is that the employees have to have confidence in the organization's leaders, right? And they have to have a spirit of collaboration and collegiality, as we alluded to before. They have to see career development opportunities for themselves. And they also have to have a clear and promising sense of purpose. Now, I want to linger on this just for a second, because a clear and promising sense of purpose, I think it's also important that it be the correct sense of purpose. That is, you can have an organization that has a bad culture because they focus on the wrong sense of purpose, and I think a perfect example of that would be the Enron organization, which had a very, very strong culture but focused entirely on the wrong sense of purpose. It wasn't a purpose around serving the interests of customers at all. In fact, it was almost a game at Enron to figure out new ways to take money from unsuspecting customers. So you can have a bad sense of purpose as well. But provided you have all that, then you can have some fairly substantial wins in this quadrant 4 category, where you have a lot of unscripted, unanticipated interactions with customers, and yet you have wise and creative employees being able to do it. Ron, you were going to talk about the medical
UCLA. Yeah, UCLA. It's actually one of my favorite near-term stories. It's actually documented a book called Prescription for Excellence. And it really just talks about the fact that even though UCLA Medical Center had developed a lot of research and developed a lot of accolades for their performance, they actually were a health system which at the time of their new CEO, a guy by the name of David Feinberg, Dr. David Feinberg, took over. Even though they had all the accolades, they actually were at a point where only about 30% of the patients that they saw on a regular basis would actually refer a family member or a friend to the UCLA Medical Center. Typically, they would refer them to somebody other than UCLA, despite all of the great success that UCLA had seen in the press from U.S. News and World Report, et cetera. So when Dr. Feinberg took over, he fundamentally thought that was a problem, and he began to work on changing the way that the medical center provided care to patients. And to do that, he focused on the culture. How do you become a more patient-centered culture? And he does a much better job of telling the story, but basically in a very short amount of time, they went from a 30% referral rate to over a 90% referral rate, and they began to capture more and more lives that were willing to refer family members and friends. They started out with, how do we talk to each other? Why do we get up in the morning? What's our purpose? How do we treat one patient at a time versus think about it as, we're here to provide care. We're actually here to take care of an individual, a person. And over a very short amount of time, he began to have a lot of success. It began to grow again, and he's become somebody that's, now I'm sharing his story. It would be a TED Med and other things, but it's a great example of how you begin to build that employee culture, get them engaged in the purpose, develop a common way of articulating and talking about the business and how we want to behave, and out of that comes results with a very patient-centered or customer-centered mindset.
And before we go to the poll, we're going to come to a poll, but I also want to tell a story of Texas Dow Employee Credit Union, TDECU, which is not a giant credit union, but bigger than a small credit union down in Texas. I've written about them considerably in the past because I saw what they did to change their culture when they had a new CEO come in a few years ago named Ed Speed, and he wanted the culture to be one where the credit union employees thought of members as part of the family and would treat them. So you'd treat a member the way you would treat your mother or your brother-in-law, let's say, when they came in. But you can't really dictate that. If it's an edict, as we all know, it's ignored. You can't really say this is our corporate policy from now on and expect people to really do that. So what Mr. Speed did was he inquired around within the employee base, and he found a few people who really desperately wanted the employee credit, the TDECU, to be a more trustworthy, more customer-friendly organization, and he recruited them to come up with their own culture change policy, and basically allowed them the leeway to come up with their own acronyms and their own promotional ideas, and basically they promoted this culture of customer trust, and it became something that was widely endorsed and has really led TDECU into new eras of value creation. They're acquiring other firms now, and they're prospering greatly down in Texas. So it is a culture change is a difficult thing to manage, but in the end, if you want your employees to be engaged enough to be able to handle those quadrant 4 interactions, you do have to have a culture, and a strong culture, and the best culture is probably one that is based on earning the trust of customers. Now I'm going to turn it over back to Elizabeth, right? Liz, you're going to ask a full question?
Yes. So that was a great discussion of those 4 types of interactions. I imagine that everyone within their organization can think of examples of each of those quadrants, within their own personal experience. So we have a question for the attendees. We've got a lot of industries, a lot of companies represented, but we're looking to see what kind of challenges may be happening when it comes to actually optimizing these quadrants and these types of interactions. So of the 4 quadrants discussed, which is the biggest challenge to optimize within your organization? So for those of you attending, if you want to think about the types of interactions that your company has, just maybe think about which may be the most challenging to really optimize and get that most out of that interaction. So if you want to take a minute and think about it and choose your choice, we will push the results to everyone to see how they compare to others as well. So take 1 minute. All right, so based on our attendees, we can take a look at the results. And it looks like, not surprisingly, the surprises, trials, and tribulations is the most challenging, but it looks like there are other challenges with each of the other quadrants as well. And it seems as what Don and Ron, you were discussing, that the unpredictable events are probably the ones that are the hardest to manage and optimize and really prepare for. But as you're saying, especially in the culture discussion, that really goes a long way in trying to set up an organization that is prepared for anything. But I know we've got more to discuss about how technology and competition plays in that. So if, Don, you want to take over again?
Yep. Let's go to the section on the role of technology, basically. It ought to be obvious that technology can improve decisions. It can extend and enhance the decision maker's own capabilities. Basically, technology can improve your interactions with customers, but in several ways. Machines cannot automate non-routine decisions. There are always going to be things that you have not anticipated in the past and which your computers are not going to have anticipated or planned for, things that will defeat your systems in different ways. It doesn't matter how complex the system is, as long as it's a system, it is not going to be able to anticipate everything. On the other hand, technology can extend and enhance your own capabilities as a decision maker. For instance, it reduces the time that you have to spend on low-value transactional activities. So your key salespeople no longer have to spend a whole lot of time filing their expense report, maybe, or updating the sales report. Those are done increasingly by automation, and that kind of automation greatly improves the efficiency of these non-routine decision makers. The people who have the judgment and wisdom to apply need to have time to apply that. Technology also extends the breadth and impact of non-routine decisions. As Ron mentioned, the way teletech captures in a social context, teletech captures inbound queries and inputs from customers that haven't been planned for, and collects them and aggregates them. And when you make a decision with respect to how to handle something like that, that it increases the scalability of that kind of thing, which boosts the quality and speed of your decisions. So the implications for competition are significant, because the bottom line is that proficiency in non-routine decisions is not something that is easily copied by your competitors. Companies that have a strong culture, and by the way, lots of studies have shown that companies that tend to persist as profitable companies over long periods of time all tend to have reasonably strong cultures that allow the company's employees to deal with great technical changes while still holding on to something that they believe in. Whether it's Disney or Walmart or GE or HP, these companies all have strong cultures. The efficiency advantages that you get from automating production and automating your interactions, handling standard moments of truth, those efficiency interactions are good, but they're easily imitated, right? In fact, those kinds of efficiencies eventually permeate an entire industry as other people glom onto them. Amazon does this right now, but in the near future, everybody's going to automatically remind you if you've already bought a product you're about to buy, if there's an indication that you might be buying it by mistake. it's the proficiency at non-routine decisions. It's the quadrant 4 proficiency, really, that can't be as easily imitated. There are more complex organizational models that slow the dissemination of performance improvements, and anyway, think about it. What is a best practice in wise decision making? Anyway, what is that? What does that even mean, right? So there are important reasons here. And global companies, the big companies, they definitely get it. The world's biggest companies actually are growing at a faster percentage rate than smaller firms. And it's not just because of the scale and market dominance. It's because they're leveraging these capabilities for non-routine decisions. By connecting their employees and harvesting this socially learned information the way Cisco does and Teletech does and other big firms in the quadrant 4 interactions, their employees are creating a kind of a network effect. A network gets stronger and stronger the more members there are in the network. And as long as your employees are highly connected, then they're benefiting from that effect. I think a really good example of that is ExxonMobil. They think global and they act local. They have 86,000 workers, down from 100,000 over the last 5 years. 10 separate operating companies. They use 3 major brands, Exxon, Mobil, Esso. They're present in more than 150 countries. Their sales are the size of Taiwan's economy, and their entire headquarters staff is 300. They have no more seats at their headquarters building than 300. That's all they need. Why? Because they have a strong culture. They have a strong social collection, social architecture for the collecting of that non-routine information. And they are able to disseminate those non-routine decisions. The thing is, if you have an organization that is where employees are engaged and enabled, and enablement is a very important characteristic here. ExxonMobil has enabled their employees with this network architecture, all right? But if you have employees that are engaged and enabled, then you're able to self-organize. So when a customer problem or a crisis comes in, you don't have to send things up to the CEO to get a decision and wait for the decision to come down. Your employees generally know what the right direction of change is, what the right general strategy is. They all kind of agree on the true north for the organization. Whatever that true north is, it's a cultural icon, whatever that stands for, whatever you're in business to do. They know what to do. They have the power to do it, so they glom onto the problem and they get it solved without a lot of top-down direction. You don't have a CEO having to say, do this now, do that then, now do this, and now do that. So it's an extremely useful form of organization, which is informed with a strong culture, with a strong sense of purpose that gives your employees direction even in the absence of top-down guidance. So that's our presentation for today. And Liz, I'll turn it over to you. Do we have some Q&A?
Oh, we do. Yeah, we've got some great questions. Thank you, Don and Ron, for really sharing your expertise and knowledge in such an important area of business strategy. We do have a few minutes left for Q&A. If we don't get to everyone's question in the next few minutes, we will be able to answer you via email and provide any more follow-up if you'd like. There's some contact information at the end. And before we begin the Q&A, I just would like to remind you that you can download a PDF copy of today's presentation with the green resources link. And there's also a PDF reprint of Don Pepper's original blog on this topic. So you can take that with you kind of as a short summary of what we discussed today. And as I mentioned earlier, Peppers & Rogers Group has expanded its reach into the operational side of strategy to deliver a more holistic suite of customer strategy services. So if you're interested in learning more, you can contact Don Peppers or Tom Schmazel. His information I'll be posting as well. So you can follow up after the Q&A if we don't get to some of your questions. So with that, let's get to some of your questions. Thank you to everybody who has submitted. You still have time if you'd like to submit one right now. Just hit the Q&A button and we will definitely get to it. Our first question is, someone was wondering what your thoughts were on mitigating risk of sending an auto-generated communication, say based on life cycle, that's actually ill-timed by accident. So how can you mitigate that sort of risk?
Well, I'll talk to it first, and Ron, maybe you have something to say on this too. But I think the first thing is to acknowledge that it is a risk and to be prepared for the possibility that things will go wrong. I think also it's important to recognize sort of the range of error of our own predictions here. We've talked about these quadrants as if all the moments of truth on the right can be anticipated easily, and all the ones on the left can't be. But the truth is that there's a scale there, and some events are easily anticipated and very accurately so, and some events are only not so accurately anticipated, but sort of anticipated. And I think it's important to recognize the degree of confidence you have in your own predictive analytics program and your own ability to really understand what a particular individual customer might be thinking or asking or indicating with their interactions to you. There have been a lot of books written on the issue of big data and statistics and analysis, but something everybody tends to agree on is that having an ability to sort of understand the risks and limitations of this kind of statistical analysis is going to be a bedrock skill for business leaders going into the future. It's going to be something that everybody's going to require. It's almost as important as literacy is 100 years ago. So that's what I would say is first be aware of that limitation. And one more thing, when the misstep occurs, acknowledge, apologize, and act. Take those 3 steps. Acknowledge immediately our mistake. Apologize, really sorry, we didn't mean to do that. We misstepped, right? And then here's what we're doing, to fix this or to help you or to avoid it in the future.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Don, is there is a way, to your point, around taking information that we know about our customer base and those life cycle events and developing a risk profile. We've done this quite a bit, especially in some of the financial services work that we've done, where we begin to understand what the risks are for these automated messages, and then we're able to develop, I wouldn't call it a custom, but I'd call it a customized approach to how those automated messages are generated. So there are some tactics to help reduce the amount of risk. To Don's point, it is definitely a risk, and we need to be aware of that, and there's probably going to be some times that we won't get it exactly right, but there is a way to proactively model that and determine what are the right risk profiles, and then match the automated messaging to go with that. So there are tactics to deal with it. So.
Great. So my next question relates to Sector 3, Quadrant 3, which is the threats to cost efficiency. And our attendee wants to know, which approach to Sector 3 do you think customers respond better to? Is it the automation self-service part or a more educated and enabled human interaction?
Well, I think obviously customers always respond to human interaction best. There's no question about that. The only question about whether that's the right thing to do or not, it's really more of a cost question from your standpoint. If you have millions of customers, it would obviously be valuable to each of them to have a human being at your organization interact with them personally, but it's not always possible economically. So, I mean, within reason, I think human interaction is better. But the whole goal of this kind of analysis is to think about how you can do a better job of automating those things that are highly costly to handle because they require manual intervention. I don't know, Ron, do you have a different perspective?
No, I think I would just echo your message that human interaction is always better as long as it's a cost-effective way to do it. And then it depends also on the customer itself. So if, for example, today I would say the millennials don't necessarily need human interaction. They like the idea of chatting or taking care of a self-service in their own way. So the closer you can get to the affinity that each individual customer has to their desired form of interaction is the best way to go. But obviously human interaction or the sense that I'm communicating with a human via chat or a persona on chat is always the best way to go. So.
Great. And we've got another question that I think is particularly interesting. I think it's kind of a question that a lot of people have about balancing efficiency and effectiveness. And someone said that while they don't manage call centers, they're interested in what your position is on the idea of handle time or other like process measures and how those may enable or prohibit people from accomplishing a quality experience.
Ron, you want to take that?
Yeah, I will. So actually we're finding that more and more of our clients are moving away from a single dimension or even what we would consider to be efficiency types of measures like average handle time. I mean, based on the specific type of customer, they may have a better interaction by an increased average handle time. So if we're supposed to be more customer-centered, we may want to offset the normal singular focus on efficiency, which has been driven by the whole outsourcing craze around call centers, that we want to reduce average handle time. But in some cases, average handle time should be higher based on that specific type of question, or it could be basically that specific type of customer or segmented type of customer. So it can't be a one-size-fits-all is the first thing, and you have to do it in a broad context of an NPS or a customer satisfaction score offset with the efficiency measurement. So the challenge is that if you get so singularly focused on efficiency, it'll drive poor customer behaviors, and I think that's where the question was going to. So taking a step back and trying to determine which type of customer segment that you're working with may drive you to a different decision around average handle time, and even something like a first call resolution type of question, and rethinking it. At the end of the day, you'd like to answer it the first time as much as possible, but that may go counter to something else that you're trying to do in the broader cross-section of the efficiency piece. So it's not I guess the point is it's not a one-size-fits-all, and you need to do it in the whole idea around customer satisfaction, right. Offset by efficiency. So.
Right. Oh, and Liz, I see one question here. If I could call it out on the board, gentleman's
Sure.
asking, with the continued string of recalls at Toyota, it's surprising you hold them out as an example of a great company. And let me just address that. I think Toyota is a very good company. I think their culture is well known. But even good companies make mistakes. And as many of you know, Toyota's culture, and by the way, they're not a client of ours, so we're not associated with them in any way that I know of. But fundamentally, they have a 5-part culture: Kaizen, meaning continuous improvement; challenge, they don't view problems negatively, but as a way to improve performance; teamwork, company's interests come first; Genchi Genbutsu, which in Japanese means sort of go to the source. Don't take somebody's word for something. If you're looking at a problem, go right to the source and find out for yourself. And their 5th principle is respect for others. That is, Toyota wants you to express differences with others, but to do so respectfully. And there's a saying at Toyota: if 2 employees always agree, then one of them is redundant. And Toyota's culture has helped them out of a lot of jams. But one of the most important issues to remember is that no matter how good your culture is, and no matter how good you are as a company, and no matter how well-intentioned you are, you're going to have problems all the time. And in October 2009, there was a big floor mat recall. Remember when Toyotas were recalling, they were recalled 3.8 million cars for something called pedal entrapment by the floor mats. And in January 2010, Toyota told the National Highway Transportation Safety Authority that certain pedals could have defects, and they recalled another 2.3 million cars, and they stopped selling the affected vehicles. This was a disaster, and there was Senate Commerce Committee hearings, and a lot of people were complaining about Toyota. In the final tally, they recalled some 11 million cars. But the truth is, the pedal entrapment really was a driver problem, But Toyota took a different approach than Audi had taken a few years before that. Remember when Audi had the same kind of problem with acceleration, and they blamed it on the driver, and they refused to take responsibility for it, and the market just lashed out at them, and sales plummeted. What Toyota's president, Akio Toyoda, he came on national news, and he apologized publicly, saying the company will not blame its customers, and they promised a new design so that even if the driver makes a mistake, it won't cause an accident. And that was a very upfront kind of thing to do. They were doing a lot of surveying, and customers generally rated their response to the crisis excellent. But I just happen to have a blogger's comment on the Motley Fool at the time. One blogger said, "No doubt Toyota made a mistake, or multiple mistakes. But I also think that people realize the media blew things out of proportion. I think when people believe there is unjust persecution or piling on happening, they tend to give the guilty party a little benefit of the doubt. I'm more steamed at AIG and the banks than at Toyota." This, remember, was right after the financial crisis. Fundamentally, what happens is if you develop a reputation for being trustable, an Amazon-type reputation, a USAA-type reputation, and I believe Toyota has nearly that kind of a reputation, then your customers are going to give you the benefit of the doubt in these kinds of situations. And there will always be these kinds of situations. Amazon is going to have them. USAA is going to have them. Toyota is going to have them. And you can't predict them in advance. If you could, you wouldn't have them. So the whole point of this exercise is to talk about how companies can best survive these kinds of unanticipated disasters and issues, and one of the best ways to do it is to have in advance a very customer-oriented culture, a culture that puts the customer's interests first.
Excellent point, Don. So we've got one more question before we end. And once again, for those of you who've asked questions that we haven't gotten to, we will respond back to you with either email or we'll call follow-up. And we can, if you'd like to reach out to us about some more individual attention to your business, feel free to contact us, and we'll be happy to try to set something up. So my last question, Ron, maybe you can talk about this a little bit, is how do you handle associates who are afraid of the autonomy that you're trying to encourage?
Yeah, that's a great question because we see that a lot. Really, it's a matter of developing the people, and it begins with hiring people that during the hiring process, making sure you select people that are going to be able to fill that need as you begin to develop the autonomy. And then, over time, for the people that are already in the organization, as you begin to try and change the culture, you just got to help them develop the confidence that goes with that. And that's a long-term journey, just like any other culture change or behavior change activity. It takes, years, and certainly months, but certainly not days and weeks. So that's where the cycles of use activity comes in. This is where we talk a lot about coaching and spending time with developing people's skills, and then over time they'll develop that confidence that they need. And those that don't develop the confidence, then there might be a spot for them where they're less need for autonomy, and it's more of a repeatable task, more associated with quadrant 1 that Don talked about early on, to where it may not be quite something that could be automated, but needs a human intervention in it as well. So maybe that's a better fit for those folks. So there's no question you're going to run up against that, but there are lots of different tactics you can use to develop them as much as possible, and where you can't develop them, then maybe there's a place that they can be more successful within the organization, taking on a different type of role.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion. I thank everyone for their questions, and I thank you to Don Peppers and Ron Wince for presenting today. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so like I said, any unanswered questions will be addressed via email, and feel free to contact us if you have additional questions. This concludes Preparing for the Unexpected, a Customer Strategist webinar. We hope to conduct future Customer Strategist webinars covering topics of importance to customer executives in the future. So please stay tuned for those. And on behalf of the entire team, thanks for attending and have a great day.